The elderly man burst into tears when he saw what the food delivery man had taken from his wallet. Earl Hawkins gazed out the window of his modest apartment in Millbrook, a small city nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. At 78 years old, he had seen more than his fair share of life's ups and downs. The wrinkles on his face told stories of laughter and sorrow, of triumphs and defeats. But these days, the predominant emotion etched into those lines was loneliness. It had been 5 years since his beloved wife Margaret had passed away, 5 long years of quiet meals, solitary walks in the park, and evenings spent watching reruns of old game shows. Their daughter Lily lived on the other side of the country in Sacramento, California. Between her demanding job as a corporate lawyer and raising 2 teenagers, visits were few and far between. Earl's daily routine had become a monotonous blur. Wake up, make coffee, read the newspaper, watch the news, have lunch, take a nap, watch more TV, have dinner, go to bed, rinse and repeat. The highlight of his week was usually his trip to the local grocery store, where he'd exchange pleasantries with the cashier Sally, who always asked about his cat, Mr. Whiskers. But lately, even Mr. Whiskers seemed disinterested in Earl's company, preferring to spend his days lounging on the fire escape, watching the bustling world below with feline indifference. As Earl sat in his worn leather armchair, absent-mindedly flipping through channels, his stomach grumbled. He glanced at the clock, 6:30 p.m. Time for dinner. With a heavy sigh, he reached for the stack of takeout menus on the side table. Chinese? Pizza? No. He'd had those earlier this week. His eyes fell on a bright orange flyer for a new food delivery app called SwiftBite. Get your favorite meals delivered right to your door, the flyer proclaimed in cheerful lettering. Earl had never been one for newfangled technology, but the thought of trying something different, even if it was just ordering food through an app, seemed oddly appealing. With some effort and a fair bit of squinting, Earl managed to download the app onto his old smartphone, a gift from Lily that he rarely used for anything other than occasional calls. He fumbled through the registration process, muttering under his breath about kids these days and their complicated gadgets. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Earl placed an order for a hot turkey sandwich from Rosie's Diner, a local eatery he'd frequented with Margaret in happier times. The app cheerfully informed him that his food would arrive in approximately 45 minutes. As he waited, Earl found himself feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. It had been so long since he'd tried anything new, and even this small act of ordering food through an app felt like a big step. He chuckled softly to himself, imagining what Margaret would say if she could see him now, fumbling with a smartphone and waiting for a delivery like some college kid. The sound of the buzzer startled Earl out of his reverie. He pressed the intercom button. Yes? SwiftBite delivery for Earl Hawkins, came a young man's voice. Come on up, Earl replied, buzzing him in. A few moments later, there was a knock at the door. Earl opened it to find a young man in his early 20s with tousled brown hair and bright green eyes, holding a paper bag emblazoned with the Rosie's Diner logo. Good evening, sir, the young man said with a warm smile. I'm Zach, your SwiftBite driver. Here's your order from Rosie's Diner. As Earl took the bag, he couldn't help but notice the friendly demeanor of the delivery driver. It had been so long since someone other than Sally the cashier had smiled at him like that. Thank you, Zach, Earl said, fumbling in his pocket for a tip. I hope the stairs weren't too much trouble. Zach waved off the concern. Not at all, sir. It's good exercise. Besides, the view from up here must be amazing. Earl glanced back at his living room window. He hadn't really thought about the view in years. I suppose it is, he admitted. Would you like to take a look? For a moment, Zach hesitated, clearly torn between professional duty and genuine curiosity. Finally, he nodded. If you don't mind, that would be great. I've always wondered what the city looks like from up here. Earl stepped aside, allowing Zach to enter. The young man moved to the window, his eyes widening as he took in the panoramic view of Millbrook's twinkling lights against the backdrop of the setting sun. Wow, Zach breathed. This is incredible. You're so lucky to have this view every day. Earl joined him at the window, seeing his familiar view through fresh eyes. I guess I am. he said softly. Sometimes we forget to appreciate what's right in front of us. They stood there for a moment, two strangers united by a simple act of human connection. Then, remembering himself, Zach stepped back. I should get going. More deliveries to make. Thank you for letting me see this, Mr. Hawkins. Earl, the old man corrected. Call me Earl. Zach nodded, smiling. Have a good evening, Earl. Enjoy your sandwich. As the door closed behind Zach, Earl found himself standing in his living room, holding his dinner, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. A spark of something that felt suspiciously like hope. Little did Earl know that this simple interaction was the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. In the weeks that followed, Earl found himself using the SwiftBite app more frequently. He told himself it was because of the convenience, the variety of food options, and the fact that he didn't have to brave the increasingly chilly autumn weather to get a good meal. But deep down, he knew there was another reason, the possibility of seeing Zach again. It wasn't that Earl was lonely. Well, he was, but he'd grown accustomed to his solitude over the years. It was more that his brief interaction with Zach had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, the simple joy of human connection. As luck would have it, Zach did show up for several of Earl's deliveries. Each time their interactions grew a little longer, a little more personal. Earl learned that Zach was a student at Millbrook Community College, studying graphic design. Zach, in turn, discovered that Earl was a retired high school history teacher with a passion for Civil War trivia. One particularly blustery evening in late October, Zach arrived with Earl's order from the new Thai place downtown. As Earl opened the door, a gust of wind sent a chill through the hallway. Good grief, it's getting cold out there, Earl remarked, taking the bag from Zach. You must be freezing, son. Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee before you head back out? Zach hesitated for a moment, then nodded gratefully. That would be amazing, thank you. I just finished my last delivery for the night, actually. As Earl busied himself in the small kitchen, Zach's eyes roamed around the living room. His gaze fell on a shelf filled with framed photographs. One in particular caught his attention. A younger Earl, his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. Is this your wife? Zach asked as Earl returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Earl's eyes softened as he looked at the photo. Yes, that's my Margaret. She passed away 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Zach said quietly. She looks like she was a wonderful person. She was, Earl replied, a wistful smile playing on his lips. The best person I ever knew. We were married for 48 years, can you believe it? Zach shook his head in amazement. That's incredible. My parents split up when I was just a kid. I can't even imagine being with someone for that long. As they sipped their coffee, Earl found himself opening up to Zach in a way he hadn't done with anyone in years. He told stories about his life with Margaret, about their adventures and misadventures, about the joy of raising their daughter Lily, and the heartbreak of watching Margaret slowly slip away to cancer. Zach listened attentively, asking questions and sharing bits of his own life in return. He told Earl about growing up in foster care, about his struggles to pay for college, and his dreams of starting his own design agency someday. Before they knew it, 2 hours had passed. Zach glanced at his watch and jumped up. Oh man, I didn't realize it was so late. I should get going. Thank you so much for the coffee and the company, Earl. As Zach headed for the door, Earl felt a pang of sadness. It had been so long since he'd enjoyed a conversation like this. Zach, he called out impulsively, would you like to come over for dinner sometime? I make a mean pot roast. Zach turned, a surprised but pleased expression on his face. I'd like that, Earl. I'd like that a lot. As the door closed behind Zach, Earl felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to something. Across town, in his small studio apartment, Zach lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened that night. Growing up in the foster system, he'd never really known what it was like to have a grandfather, but talking with Earl, hearing his stories, seeing the wisdom and kindness in his eyes, it felt like a glimpse into what that relationship might have been like. As both men drifted off to sleep that night, neither could have imagined how their lives were about to intertwine in ways they never expected. As autumn gave way to winter, Earl and Zach's friendship blossomed. Their weekly dinners became a fixture in both their lives, a bright spot that they each looked forward to with growing anticipation. For Earl, these evenings were a renaissance of sorts. He found himself digging out old photo albums, unearthing forgotten mementos, and sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. Zach was an eager audience, his eyes wide with wonder as Earl recounted tales of his youth, his travels with Margaret, and the challenges and joys of his years as a teacher. "You should write these stories down, Earl," Zach said one evening as they sat by the fireplace nursing mugs of hot cocoa. "They're too good to be forgotten." Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I don't know about that. Who'd want to read the ramblings of an old man?" "I would," Zach replied without hesitation. "And I bet a lot of other people would too. Your life is like a history book come to life." The idea planted a seed in Earl's mind. He'd always enjoyed writing, had even harbored dreams of becoming an author in his youth before the practical concerns of supporting a family had led him to teaching. Maybe it wasn't too late to revisit that dream. For Zach, these evenings with Earl were an anchor in his often chaotic life. Between his classes, his work as a delivery driver, and his freelance design projects, Zach's days were a whirlwind of activity and stress. But in Earl's cozy apartment, with its faded wallpaper and comfortable silences, Zach found a peace he'd never known before. As Christmas approached, Zach noticed Earl becoming more withdrawn. The old man's eyes would often drift to the empty armchair across from his, a chair that Zach now knew had been Margaret's favorite spot. "The holidays are always tough," Earl admitted one snowy evening. "Margaret loved Christmas. She'd start decorating right after Thanksgiving, turn this whole place into a winter wonderland." Zach looked around the bare apartment, an idea forming in his mind. "Well," he said slowly, "why don't we decorate? I mean, if you want to. We could go get a tree, some lights, make this place festive again." Earl's initial reaction was to refuse. The thought of celebrating without Margaret seemed wrong somehow, but as he looked at Zach's eager face, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to create some new traditions. The next day, they bundled up and headed to the local Christmas tree lot. As they wandered among the fragrant pines, Zach couldn't help but notice how Earl's step seemed lighter, his eyes brighter. They picked out a modest tree, and Zach insisted on paying for it, brushing aside Earl's protests. Back at the apartment, they spent the afternoon decorating. Zach climbed up on a stepladder to hang lights, while Earl unpacked boxes of ornaments that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Each bauble held a memory, and Earl found himself sharing stories as they trimmed the tree. "This one," Earl said, holding up a slightly lopsided clay star. "Lily made this in second grade. Margaret insisted on putting it right in the front every year, even though it looked terrible." Zach laughed, taking the ornament and hanging it prominently on the tree. "Well, we can't break tradition now, can we?" As the sun set, they stood back to admire their handiwork. The apartment glowed with warm light, the tree twinkling merrily in the corner. Earl felt a lump form in his throat as he looked around. It wasn't the same as when Margaret was here, but it was beautiful in its own way. "Thank you, Zach," he said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." Zach squeezed Earl's shoulder gently. "That's what friends are for, right?" As they sat down to enjoy some hot apple cider, Zach's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face fell. "Everything okay?" Earl asked, concerned. Zach sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, it's just my landlord. He's raising the rent again. I don't know how I'm going to afford it on top of tuition next semester." Earl frowned, an idea forming in his mind. "You know," he said cautiously, "this place is pretty big for just me. The spare room's just collecting dust these days. If you wanted, well, you'd be welcome to stay here. Rent-free, of course. You could save up for school." Zach stared at Earl, stunned. "Are you serious? Earl, that's incredibly generous. But I couldn't impose like that." Earl waved away his protests. "Impose? Zach, you've brought more life into this old place in the past few months than it's seen in years. Having you here would be a gift. To both of us, I think." Tears welled up in Zach's eyes. He'd never had anyone offer him something like this before, never had a place that felt like a real home. "I don't know what to say, Earl. Thank you. I'd love to." As they hugged, both men felt a sense of rightness, as if some missing piece had finally clicked into place. Neither could have imagined on that first night when Zach delivered Earl's dinner that they would end up here. But sometimes, the most beautiful connections are the ones we never see coming. Little did they know, the most surprising connection of all was yet to be revealed. As winter melted into spring, Earl and Zach settled into a comfortable routine. Zach moved into the spare room, transforming it into a cozy space that reflected his artistic sensibilities while respecting the history of the apartment. His graphic design books mingled with Earl's history tomes on the bookshelf, and his laptop often sat next to Earl's typewriter on the dining room table. For Earl, having Zach in the apartment brought a vitality he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The sound of Zach's music drifting from his room, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the late-night conversations about life, art, and everything in between. It all combined to create a sense of home that Earl hadn't felt since Margaret passed away. Zach, for his part, flourished under Earl's grandfatherly guidance. His grades improved as Earl helped him develop better study habits, and his confidence grew as Earl encouraged him to pursue his passion for design. In Earl, Zach found the stable, supportive family figure he'd always longed for. But as close as they had become, there were still shadows in both their pasts that remained unspoken. One rainy afternoon in April, as Earl was sorting through some old boxes in the closet, he came across a photo album he hadn't seen in years. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing pictures from a time in his life he had tried hard to forget. There, staring back at him, was a younger version of himself standing next to a beautiful young woman. But it wasn't Margaret. The woman's name was Claire, and she had been Earl's first love, long before he met Margaret. As Earl flipped through the pages, the memories came flooding back. He and Claire had been college sweethearts, deeply in love and planning a future together. But their relationship had ended abruptly and painfully when Claire discovered she was pregnant. Scared and unprepared for parenthood, they had made the difficult decision to give the baby up for adoption. The guilt and pain of that decision had haunted Earl for years. He and Claire had gone their separate ways after that, unable to face each other or the consequences of their choice. Earl had eventually met and fallen in love with Margaret, but he had never told her about Claire or the baby. It was a secret he had carried alone for decades. Lost in his memories, Earl didn't hear Zach enter the room. "Hey, Earl, I was thinking we could order pizza for dinner." "Earl? Are you okay?" Earl looked up, startled, his eyes misty with unshed tears. "Oh, Zach, I'm sorry, I was just remembering." Zach's brow furrowed with concern as he knelt beside Earl. "Those photos, they're not of Margaret, are they?" Earl shook his head slowly. "No, they're not. This is Claire, my first love." Sensing the weight of the moment, Zach sat down next to Earl. "I've never heard you mention her before. Do you want to talk about it?" For a moment, Earl hesitated. He had never shared this part of his past with anyone. But looking at Zach's kind, understanding face, he felt a sudden urge to unburden himself. "Claire and we were young and in love," Earl began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we had our whole lives figured out. But then, she got pregnant." Zach listened intently as Earl poured out the whole story, the shock of the pregnancy, the fear and uncertainty, the heart-wrenching decision to give up the baby, and the guilt that had followed him ever since. "We never even knew if it was a boy or a girl," Earl finished, wiping his eyes. "I've always wondered, always hoped that the child had a good life, a loving family." Zach placed a comforting hand on Earl's shoulder. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Earl. It must have been so hard to carry this secret for all these years." Earl nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. "I've never told anyone before, not even Margaret. I always felt like I was betraying Claire's trust and the baby's by talking about it." "You were both so young," Zach said gently. "You made the best decision you could in a difficult situation. I'm sure your child understood that, wherever they are now." As they sat there surrounded by the ghosts of Earl's past, neither man could have imagined how closely this long-buried secret was entwined with their present. Zach's mind was racing. He had always known he was adopted, had always wondered about his birth parents, but he had never pursued the matter, afraid of what he might find, or worse, of being rejected again. Now, looking at the dates on the photos and doing some quick mental math, a wild, impossible thought began to form in his mind, but he pushed it away. It couldn't be. The odds were astronomical. And yet, Earl, Zach said hesitantly, do you remember when exactly this happened? The year, I mean? Earl thought for a moment. It would have been the spring of 1996. April, I think. Why do you ask? Zach felt his heart skip a beat. April 1996. The same month and year he had been born. The same month and year he had been given up for adoption. I was adopted, Zach said, his voice shaking slightly. I was born in April 1996. Earl's eyes widened as the implication of Zach's words sank in. For a moment, the room seemed to spin around them as they stared at each other, seeing their features in a new light, searching for similarities they had never noticed before. Could it be possible? After all these years, could fate have brought them together in such an incredible way? As the rain continued to fall outside, Earl and Zach sat in stunned silence, the photo album between them, on the cusp of a revelation that would change both their lives forever. The days following Earl's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for both men. They danced around the subject, both afraid to voice the possibility that hung in the air between them. What if they were wrong? What if this incredible coincidence was just that, a coincidence? Zach threw himself into his schoolwork and design projects, staying up late into the night, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Earl, for his part, found himself poring over old letters and documents, searching for any clue that might confirm or deny their suspicions. It was Zach who finally broke the tension one evening, as they sat at the dining room table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. "Earl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to find out for sure. About, whether we're—" Earl nodded, relief washing over him. "You're right. We can't go on like this wondering. But Zach, I want you to know, whatever we find out, it doesn't change how I feel about you. You've become family to me, regardless of biology." Zach felt tears prick at his eyes. "I feel the same way, Earl. But I need to know. We need to know." They decided to start with Zach's adoption records. As a closed adoption, the information was limited, but it did confirm that Zach had been born in Millbrook and given up for adoption by a young couple who were college students at the time. Earl's hands shook as he read the document. It matched his memories exactly, the timing, the circumstances, but it wasn't quite enough to be certain. "We could do a DNA test," Zach suggested hesitantly. "Those home kits are pretty accurate these days." Earl agreed, and they ordered a kit online that very night. The wait for the results was agonizing. They tried to go about their daily routines, but there was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of standing on the precipice of a life-changing discovery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the email arrived with the results. Zach and Earl sat side by side on the couch, staring at Zach's laptop screen. "Are you ready?" Zach asked, his finger hovering over the mouse. Earl took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." Zach clicked, and the screen filled with charts and percentages, but their eyes were drawn to one line of text. Probability of grandfather-grandson relationship, 99.9%. The room seemed to spin around them. Earl let out a choked sob, while Zach sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down his face. "It's true," Earl whispered. You're my grandson." They embraced, both crying now, years of loneliness and searching melting away in the warmth of their newfound connection. As they pulled apart, wiping their eyes and laughing through their tears, the magnitude of their discovery began to sink in. "I can't believe it," Zach said, shaking his head in wonder. "All this time, we've been right here, so close to each other." Earl nodded, still dazed. "It's a miracle, Zach. A true miracle." As the evening wore on, they talked for hours, filling in the gaps in each other's lives, marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them together. Earl shared stories about Claire, about the young man he had been, about the dreams and fears that had led to their decision. Zach talked about his childhood in foster care, his search for belonging, and how finding Earl had filled a void he hadn't even known existed. "I wish I had known," Earl said, regret heavy in his voice. "I wish I had been there for you, for your mother." Zach squeezed his grandfather's hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Earl and Zach found themselves looking towards the future with new eyes. They had found each other against impossible odds, and in doing so, had found a piece of themselves they didn't know was missing. But as they would soon discover, their journey was far from over. The final chapter of their story was yet to be written, and it would bring with it one last surprising twist. In the weeks that followed their discovery, Earl and Zach's relationship deepened in ways they never could have imagined. They spent hours poring over old photo albums, with Earl pointing out family resemblances and sharing stories about relatives Zach had never known he had. Zach, in turn, shared his hopes and dreams for the future with a newfound openness, knowing he now had family to support him. As spring bloomed into summer, they decided it was time to share their incredible story with the rest of the family. Earl reached out to his daughter Lily, Zach's aunt, and arranged for her to visit. The reunion was emotional and joyous. Lily was shocked at first, then overjoyed to discover she had a nephew. She hugged Zach tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I always wanted a sibling," she said, laughing through her tears. "I guess I got a nephew instead." As they sat around the dining room table that evening, sharing a meal and swapping stories, Earl couldn't help but marvel at how full his once lonely apartment had become. The laughter and warmth reminded him of happier times with Margaret, and he found himself wishing she could have been there to see this miracle. It was Zach who brought up the subject they had all been tiptoeing around. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant but determined. "I'd like to try and find my birth mother." "My mother," he corrected, looking at Earl. "Your daughter." Earl felt a mix of emotions at Zach's words. Hope, fear, guilt. "Are you sure, Zach?" "I don't even know if Claire is still in Millbrook or if she'd want to be found." Lily reached out and squeezed her father's hand. "I think it's worth trying, Dad. We all deserve to know our story." And so, with Lily's help, they began the search for Claire. It took weeks of detective work, scouring social media, contacting old classmates, even hiring a private investigator. Just when they were about to give up hope, they got a lead. Claire was living in a small town just an hour outside of Millbrook. She had never married, had devoted her life to teaching special needs children, and according to the investigator, she had never had another child. With trembling hands, Earl dialed the number they had been given. The voice that answered was older, but still achingly familiar. "Claire? It's Earl. Earl Hawkins. I know this is a shock, but there's something important we need to talk about." 2 weeks later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, a car pulled up in front of Earl's apartment building. Zach and Earl stood by the window, watching as a woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped out. Even from a distance, the resemblance between her and Zach was striking. As Claire made her way up to the apartment, Earl felt a lifetime of emotions washing over him. Regret for the years lost, gratitude for this second chance, and an overwhelming sense of things coming full circle. The knock on the door seemed to echo through the apartment. Earl opened it, and for a moment he and Claire just stared at each other, seeing the ghosts of their younger selves overlaid with the people they had become. "Earl," Claire whispered, her eyes filling with tears, "it's really you." And then her gaze shifted to Zach, standing nervously behind his grandfather. Her hand flew to her mouth as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Oh my God," she breathed. Are you?" Zach stepped forward, his own eyes glistening. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "I'm Zach." What followed was a reunion decades in the making. There were tears and laughter, explanations and apologies, and most of all, forgiveness. As the four of them, Earl, Claire, Zach, and Lily, sat together, sharing stories and passing around old photographs. The years seemed to melt away. Claire marveled at the man her son had become, at the incredible coincidence that had brought him into Earl's life. "I always hoped you'd find each other somehow," she said, squeezing both their hands. "I just never imagined it would happen like this." As the afternoon turned to evening, they ordered pizza, a throwback to those early days when Zach was just Earl's favorite delivery driver. They toasted to family, to second chances, and to the mysterious workings of fate that had brought them all together. Later, as Claire was preparing to leave, promising to return soon, Zach pulled Earl aside. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I found this when I was going through some of my adoption paperwork." Earl unwrapped the package with shaking hands. Inside was a faded photograph, a picture of a much younger Claire, holding a newborn baby. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, was a simple message. "For the grandparents we hope will love him as much as we do." Earl felt tears spring to his eyes as he looked at the photo, then at Zach, then at Claire standing by the door. In that moment, he felt the presence of Margaret, of all the loved ones he had lost over the years. He felt their joy, their approval, their love. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling Zach into a tight hug. "Thank you for finding me." As the door closed behind Claire, Earl looked around his apartment. The place that had once felt so empty, so full of ghosts, now buzzed with life and possibility. The walls that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with the warmth of family reunited. Earl realized that his twilight years, which he had assumed would be marked by solitude and fading memories, had instead become a new beginning. He had not only reconnected with his past, but had gained a future he never could have imagined. As he watched Zach and Lily chatting animatedly on the couch, planning future family gatherings and making up for lost time, Earl felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The lonely days were behind him. The unexpected connection he had formed with a young delivery driver had blossomed into something beautiful and life-changing. Earl smiled to himself, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led to this moment. Life, he realized, was full of surprises, and sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected packages, or in this case, delivered right to your door.